As the amount of billion-dollar disasters skyrocket, society continues to allow people to move into poorly built homes in risky areas. What if more attention was placed on informing consumers on how to make better choices on where they live and how their homes are built? On this episode of the GeoTrek podcast, Aris Papadopoulos shares a broad context of where our system is broken and how consumers can take steps to better protect themselves. Hey everyone, I'm Hurricane Hal, host of the GeoTrek podcast, where we explore the world to tell stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow our content online. The GeoTrek podcast is available on your favorite podcast platform. And also don't miss out on our growing YouTube channel, where you can watch a video version of every single podcast. Well, a more informal introduction of today's guest, Aris Papadopoulos, is the founding chair of Resilience Action Fund, a nonprofit that educates consumers and businesses on how to protect homes, buildings, and communities from hazards. You can find them at buildingresilient.com. He authored the books Resilience, The Ultimate Sustainability, and Resilionomics, Value in an Age of Disasters. The books inspired the PBS documentaries Built to Last and Built to Last, Buyer Beware. Well, without further introduction, let's jump into this GeoTrek podcast episode with Aris Papadopoulos. Aris, welcome to the GeoTrek podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Hal.
It's so great to have you on the show. We have a lot of great information we're going to cover today. We wanted to start by asking you about your interest in consumer resilience. Could you share a little bit about your professional path? How did you get involved in this sector?
Well, I'm an engineer by training, and I spent most of my career in the construction industry, heavy construction materials. But really what triggered my interest was being at the World Trade Center in 9/11, getting away from the buildings, and then seeing the South Tower collapse from in front of my eyes. So after that, I started looking at the buildings and the world in a different way.
All right, so let's talk about that. I mean, that's an exceptional experience that has to impact you for your entire life. Were you in the World Trade Center, or where were you when the planes hit?
I was at the hotel between the two towers, and had a meeting scheduled with the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, which owned the land there and had their offices in the North Tower. So it was a 9 a.m. Meeting in the 65th floor of the North Tower, and a colleague of mine had come over from Jersey. We had a terminal there in Port Elizabeth, and we were kind of negotiating with the Port Authority to extend the lease. And he delayed us. Delayed both of us trying to finish his coffee, and I think that saved our lives. We were still in the hotel between the two towers.
All right, so what's going through your mind as you're seeing this all unfold? I mean, it's almost like, I would imagine, hard to believe what you're seeing, right?
Yeah, I couldn't for seconds there when we finally got out of the hotel, because we went down the stairwell and got out from the south end. That's where they directed us. I thought maybe I'm dreaming, maybe this is a dream, and so until I saw the second plane coming and striking. I didn't know what to think. We didn't know what had really hit it, because we couldn't see the opening from the southwest side. It was mostly on the northeast side of the North Tower. So seeing that second plane come and hit, I mean, that turned the whole thing, very real.
Well, Aris, obviously it would have a long-term impact on you personally, but also professionally. I mean, you have this background in building science and construction science, and now you're seeing buildings collapse. I mean, how did that affect your long-term viewpoint of building and construction and how to, mitigate disasters?
Yeah, the thing that stuck in my mind after that was not why are the hazards strong, but why are the assets weak? Why are the buildings weak? Why can't they, withstand the hazards? So, I started looking at buildings and then started realizing, as I was in the industry, that most of the things we build are vulnerable. That vulnerability is not just a random exception. It's the system. It's what we develop, and we build below the hazards and most people don't know that, and that started bothering me, as I started, realizing that and seeing what we're doing. I said, we affect people's lives, we affect people's fortunes, and they don't know about it, and the system is a systemic problem. The system is designed that way. And I try to change things while I was within the industry, but it's very hard. So I kind of retired early after being CEO of the company for 20 years, going through the Great Recession. And after the recovery, I decided to let younger people, continue this. And I'm going to focus on resilience. That's kind of my mission. And that's when I founded the nonprofit Resilience Action Fund. I wrote my first book, Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability, where I try to explain in layman's terms what really goes on in creating our built environment, that everybody should know. And that became the inspiration for a PBS documentary called Built to Last with a question mark a year or so later. And I followed up last year with a second book, Resilionomics, and a second PBS documentary that's now being shown around the country, and this is Resilionomics. So, that became the mission of the third phase of my life.
No, it's amazing, Aris, and you bringing all these decades of experience, and I think you're addressing these topics that need to be addressed as a society. It sounds like you're saying some of these issues are more systemic of a broken system.
Yeah, basically, what I realized is that, vulnerable development is legal. The government lets you do it, the codes let you do it, they're designed at a low level. They're designed essentially to get you out, not to save your home, not to save your buildings, not to save your community, just to get you out. That's the level the code's designed to. So it's legal, it's profitable. You can make a lot of money doing it over and over again, building to these low standards, is low cost, and you have good margins and you make good profits. And the third thing is that the consumer, the ultimate owner, doesn't know the difference. They can't tell, they can't tell looking at a house how strongly it's built, what's inside the walls, how the roof is built, whether it's going to flood, the neighborhood is nicely manicured. So we hide so many things. So the consumer's in the dark, So
Aris, you're spot on, right? People go in to see a house, they're fixated on the price per square foot, the granite countertops, the new kitchen, right? It sounds like they're not looking at the things they should be looking at if they want to have a resilient home.
Exactly, yeah. The property industry, it's a buyer beware market. The property industry focuses on cosmetics, and they don't want to talk about the vulnerabilities. And you only find out later, and people are surprised. They say, I didn't know, I never realized this or that. And yet they should know, and I'm trying to help that. So I in my nonprofit, I focus on the consumer. The key to change, I believe, is waking up the consumer, because ultimately the consumer, the household, is the one who pay the price, both financially and personally.
Aris, in the foreword to one of the two books you mentioned, Resilionomics, you stated that vulnerable development has become a multi-trillion-dollar industry. You explained already some of the ingredients that allow this to happen. The question I have for you, how do we break this cycle? Is the key really on educating the consumer, or are there other things we should consider as well?
Yeah, I tried while I was in the industry to change some of the codes, but it's an uphill battle, because there's so much money involved. And when there's money involved, people don't want to change, from the inside. So I've concluded after, a career and, being involved in this for over a decade now under Resilience Action Fund, that the key is to really communicate with the consumer. Unfortunately, our media does a terrible job doing that. The government doesn't do that. So, it's kind of left to a few nonprofits and some, I call myself a prophets like me, to spread the word, and hopefully it'll pick up. And I'm hoping the next generation, because this is a multi-generation effort, will do better than our generation did. I'm seeing some wakening up there, and it's happening.
Aris, I wanted to ask you, as we're trying to see change in society and a more resilient society and nation, what what like burden of that choice is really on the homeowner, and then what is on the system, like for having better codes and better standards? It sounds like from what you just said, you've tried to kind of push for better codes and to change the industry, and it sounds like because so much money is being made and it's a broken system, but it profits many. It sounds like you're saying really maybe more of that hope of change is on the homeowner or on the consumer.
Unfortunately, it is. Education is a big part of it. I wish they would teach this in school, secondary school and maybe elementary school. I even created in my nonprofit, if you go to the webpage, a illustrated educational series called Ask Uncle Rezzy, where Uncle Rezzy is kind of talking to his nephew, and his nephew's family is thinking of moving, buying another house. And Uncle Rezzy, who's a veteran, and the cartoonist kind of used me as the cartoon, turned me into a cartoon, is kind of talking to his nephew and telling him about all these things. And the nephew is talking to his parents, the young boy is talking to his parents and waking them up. I want to be able to communicate this to, our children. And I like to say, unfortunately, oftentimes professionals kind of talk above our heads, most common people can't understand what they're talking about, and even the government does that. They can't understand what they're talking about, and it's misunderstood. All this, discussion of 100-year floods and this and that. People don't understand what does that mean, or does it mean anything, and so I'm trying to take this to a level, and it should be taught in schools. And fortunately, with AI now, we've converted the illustrated series into an animated series that we're putting on our channel. It's the Resilience Action Fund YouTube channel, and we're seeing a great audience build up and great response to the animated series. So for me, education is a key point. And, if our government could do anything, would be let's do more education. Let's be more transparent. Unfortunately, local governments mostly are in bed, let's say, with the development industry. Because most of their revenue comes from real assets, real properties, and they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to scare people. They don't want to, stop the development, and so they don't want to talk about this. They kind of, do a lot of hand waving and say, okay, we're doing this and that, but they don't want to be honest with people. But I see also a trend in data democracy. It's not coming from government; it's coming from the private sector. One organization that I like a lot is First Street Foundation, and they've created a free, easier to understand than FEMA's flood information rating system, and you can go on Redfin. Unfortunately, Zillow took it down because brokers were complaining to Zillow. They're putting this information up, and they're not helping brokers move these properties faster, especially the vulnerable ones. But Redfin kept it on, and you put in your address, put your own address in, scroll to the bottom, and you'll see your flood factor. And if you're 1 to 4, you're good. Around 5, 6, you're kind of at the borderline there, and anything above that, I would avoid those properties in those neighborhoods. You're going to have to spend a lot to deal with that risk. So
well, Aris, that's great. I mean, consumers really should have the right to know their flood risk if their property's flooded before, all these types of things, right? You want people to be educated before they make a decision. Sounds like with Redfin, First Street, there are some resources out there that people can at least educate themselves before they make a choice to invest in buying a home.
Yeah. Now, if you try to get the information from FEMA, they'll tell you, oh, that's private information. We can't give it to you. You can only get it after you buy it, So you should ask the owner and say, I want you to get the information for me, And now we have a buyer's market, so you have more leverage. So, if I'm a buyer, I'd say to the owner, I want to know the history of this place. You're the owner. You ask FEMA to give you the report and share it with me. And if you can't do that, some states have passed disclosure laws. Florida is one of them, where I live. Unfortunately, those laws can allow the owner to disclose the minute before you sign the agreement. And that doesn't give you any time. What's the use of that? You need to know up front before you when you're screening properties, when you're comparing neighborhoods,
Sure.
not at the very end where you've spent time and effort lining up money. Maybe you've already got a contract on your own house that you're in, and then they tell you, oh, it flooded 5 years ago. That's too late, for me. So these disclosure laws have to become more realistic and more buyer friendly than they are today.
Yeah, for sure. And like you mentioned, it should be in the beginning of the process, right? If you're really taking it seriously and you're looking at 5 different properties, that should weigh heavily on the early decisions. Like you said, not when you go to sign papers, you find out 5 minutes before that the house is flooded. It's a little bit late by then. Aris, I wanted to ask you, with the Resilience Action Fund, geographically, are you focused more on areas with vulnerabilities to, say, flooding and hurricanes, or do you cover other hazards as well in different parts of the country?
We cover everything, and even outside the U.S. We're very active outside the U.S. with the International Finance Corp, which is part of the World Bank. I've helped them develop a building resilience index, which is a first of its kind metric for rating any building. And I'm hoping to bring it to the U.S. Essentially because IFC is focused on developing countries. And I think it's going to become the S&P credit rating for resilient buildings. And my hope is not so much the insurers are going to make this happen. It's the lenders, because, insurance companies can change their minds every year. They can rewrite the contract every year or even refuse to write a contract, and move out. But lenders, they're stuck for decades, without collateral. And so, they're realizing they can't rely on the insurance, They got to know how resilient the collateral is. And so, IFC is kind of, I helped them develop this. We've launched it in Southeast Asia. It's being launched in Latin America and in India, parts of Africa. And it's going to come around the world because they team up with other banks, including commercial banks. And when those banks see that, they're going to say, hey, why aren't we doing this? This is smart, So,
Aris, for making that index for homes to really determine how resilient they are, what factors go into that? Does that include like the geographic location? Does it include how it's built? What are the different factors you look at?
Yeah, the way the Building Resilience Index works is that it has built in the hazards for any address. So they put in all the global maps, all the global data sets. It's been completed for many countries, not all of them, but they're continuing that work. So once you put an address, you get the list of hazards. And once that list of hazards comes out, you automatically get a list of mitigation measures for all those hazards. And basically what the building has to do is answer whether it has or does not have each of the mitigation measures. So it's tailor specific to the location. But the quality control for BRI is that after those answers are made, 2 verifiers who are trained and certified by IFC, and they have to be locally certified building professionals, one of them has to be a civil or structural, have to verify that those answers are correct. And that gives it the quality that the bank can say, yeah, I can trust this. And there are 4 levels: AA, which is global best practice. Very few buildings in the world have that. A, which is kind of a high level. B, which is basic, but still B is above most local codes, in the U.S. And then NR, which means that's a certain destruction at some point, that's an event waiting to happen. And there's going to be a point in time where if you're in NR, and unfortunately too many of our buildings are NRs, the bank is going to say, I'm sorry, I'm not interested to lend you money, or the term is going to be only a couple of years, I'm going to follow what the insurance people are doing, You won't be.
I see what you're saying, because the lenders can get into these really long-term commitments. It sounds like you're saying like a 30-year mortgage or whatever it is, and all of a sudden they're maybe locked in to have a vested interest in something that's very vulnerable. Perhaps with the index, even if they're covering it, you're saying maybe a shorter term, that they're not as locked in for such a long time.
Exactly, shorter term and higher rates. So an NR at some point in the future will be, in my view, unbankable and uninsurable. And the goal really that we've set or that IFC set is, let's not build any more NRs. Let's stop building NRs. And they're going to start asking, because they fund a lot of private projects around the world. Now they're kind of testing it and rolling it out and educating. I'm doing a lot of the training for them. But they're going to be saying at some point, hey, if you're an NR, we can't participate in the finance. Sorry, you got to be at least a B. And if you're a critical facility like a hospital or a critical government facility, you should aim above B. You should at least be an A. So basically they're setting that goalpost, and that's going to change a lot of things, and we're going to see it at some point in the U.S., I believe.
Aris, it sounds like you're saying as the building resilient index becomes more widespread, it's going to actually shift even new construction where people say you don't want to have it in our building. That could have problems where it's not insurable or where lenders won't lend money, things like that in the future.
Exactly. And that's what I'm hoping for, that this will change the systemic, what I call problem that we have,
Yeah. Aris, we've talked and we've addressed already several major problems with the system and how the system's broken. Let's talk about maybe success stories. Can you think of one or two resiliency success stories where you've seen people take the hazards and the risks seriously and then either mitigate? I mean, even what we're talking about right now with the Building Resilience Index, but what are one or two of the main success stories you've seen? It could even be globally that people should be aware of and really point to as a model for how we should think and approach building resiliently.
Yeah, I have a lot of success stories, and that's the good news. Obviously, there's a lot of activity. So even though it's a tiny percent, it's an important figure. And my nonprofit also organizes an annual Resilience Awards. Is named after a former friend who was a Miami Beach commissioner, passed away suddenly, Mark Similian. But annually we award, 3 or more projects. Right now it's just limited to the state of Florida. So I'd like to point to some of those projects that have gone above the codes, above what's required. One has already received a lot of publicity and won one of our awards a couple of years ago, Babcock Ranch, which is kind of east of Fort Myers, about 30 miles inland, built on high ground. And they built, above the code in many ways. And when Irma hit, they didn't see anything. They didn't see hardly any damage and continued working. And in addition to the resilience things, they put some energy efficiency on top of that, which is good. And that's a great role model for a developer who's not going to minimum. A lot of these big public tract developers, they just go to minimum, standards, and they just, use the system to make money. Babcock Ranch didn't do that. I go to Tampa Housing Authority. Here's a housing authority in Tampa building low-income housing that's building better than a lot of the private developers that are building, high rental apartment units. So you're better, you're safer, more resilient being in a public housing authority building in Tampa, and they got one of our awards a year or so ago. Because they're going above the code, and doing that. The Seminole Indian tribe of Florida. They've adopted and they build housing for their own community. They've made money from casinos and they're using that to build above code. And they say, yeah, Florida has all these different codes. We've got a great wind code in South Florida, but that same code doesn't apply to Tampa or to the Panhandle and other areas. As if a Cat 4 can't hit there. It has hit there, but we refuse to accept that. And the lobbying is done to keep the codes low, unfortunately, to keep the system going. But they've said, the Seminole tribe has said, we're going to build to the South Florida code everywhere in Florida that we build. There's we don't care what the local code says. We're going to build to the higher code. So these are great examples, of doing that. I have an example in my own house. When I moved 25 or so years ago for business reasons to South Florida, I wanted to be on the beach. I wanted to be close to the water. And then a decade later, I kind of realized, hey, this is not good. As I got into my 50s, and I said, let me see where I can find some high ground. And I look where the original settlers came, because the original settlers were smarter than us. They could see the terrain, they could see the high ground, and that's where they went. They didn't, go to the swamplands and fill those in like we did later. So I found a spotted location at 15 feet elevation. And I like to say I paid less for that than I'd pay for a vulnerable location, And the house I'm in actually, was originally built in 1940. It has 12-inch thick concrete block walls. We don't even manufacture, the standard thickness today is 8-inch thickness. 12-inch is a special order for prisons. So, and the roof is a heavy concrete block roof. All I needed to do was put a full house generator, which is dual fuel, just in case, I lose natural gas. So, I like to say, you can, if you know what to look for, and that's what I'm trying to educate people, you can, get resilience and not have to pay more for it, make smart choices. So that's what I'm trying to do.
It sounds like if you know what factors you're looking for, you can find it. Like you can speak personally to your own life. This isn't just a message you're sharing professionally.
Exactly.
You've applied this in your own life, but like you said, you're on high ground, thick concrete walls, and it was something you were able to find there in South Florida.
Exactly, yeah. So, I like to say resilience is a choice. If you have the education, if you have the awareness, and that's what the nonprofit mission is, to empower people with the knowledge and tools for long-lasting homes and communities. That's what I'm trying to do, fill that gap. I wish, the government would do that, cities would do that, but they don't, So we're trying to do that, and your podcast hopefully will get that message further out. Everybody has to know about this, because everybody's going to be in a house or a building, whether they buy or rent, and really people put their egg nest into houses, and that's the theme of my second book, Resilionomics. They put their egg nest and they lose it, and they're set back a decade or so. I did a case study in Tampa, which a couple years ago was hit by a series. It wasn't really hit; it was sideswiped by Milton and Helene, hurricanes, but got some flood damage. So I looked at two neighborhoods in St. Pete, one at let's say 3 feet elevation, and the other just a few miles inland. And I was surprised, St. Pete inland, that's a peninsula, but has some high ground, 30 feet elevation. So two working class neighborhoods, and looked at homes, let's say in the 400,000 range, not the multi-million-dollar houses. So I looked at what happened in the 5 months after the storm on sales, and I focused on people who had bought houses in the 5 years prior and sold them in the 5 months after. And I compared these two neighborhoods, and what I found was astounding even for me, that the people who bought in the low elevation locations, they lost on average 35% of what they paid. And in the same time period, same type of houses, the people who are on the high elevation, they gained 25%, a 60% gap. And how many of those people really knew what they were buying? They didn't, And so that's a big difference.
That's interesting, Art.
Yeah.
It's probably a combination of people realizing the higher risk in low ground, but then probably some of those people in those flood-prone communities saying, hey, we can just move a few miles away, keep our kids maybe in the same school district, or at least keep the same job, right? And all of a sudden we're dozens of feet higher than we were. So maybe increasing those property values at higher elevation.
And it's the study's available on my website. The Tampa newspapers picked it up and put it on the on their news, and the local neighborhood association of the low-lying area, which is run by a realtor, kind of said, well, we don't fully agree with that, but anyway, people have had to sell, some people who couldn't afford to, it takes a decade off of your, building your fortune, building your retirement, or building your children's, education fund or whatever. And that's a high price to pay, plus the personal, suffering that goes with it.
Yeah, no, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us, Aris. It really gets people thinking. And what I'm getting from this is that there are choices out there sometimes. It's just a matter of taking a moment to think this through. And it sounds like you're saying in a lot of these disaster-prone communities, not just how you build your house, but where it's located. If you're buying houses that have already been constructed, the choice of location could have a big impact, is what I'm getting from you here. Aris, I wanted to ask you, where do you see the field of consumer resiliency going over the next 10 to 15 years? And what are the major topics we need to be aware of? I mean, where are we going into the future here?
Well, for me, resilience, and I focus on resilience in the built environment. Obviously, there's other resilience. Resilience has kind of been borrowed by so many people: energy resilience, agricultural resilience, this resilience. But I'm focusing on buildings and homes. I see it as a social movement, similar to, in the past, the conservation movement, the energy efficiency kind of movement, the organic products movement. It's really something that, I believe follows an S curve, and we're still at the low kind of, below the radar screen point, I believe. But once you get like 10-15% of, the people kind of educated and aware, then you have the herd phase, the steep increase of that, where everybody wants to do it. And guess what? Politicians jump in only when they see the wave, the big wave. Then they jump in and say, okay, we need to make this part of our, regulation. But they're not early movers, So I see it as a social movement that's going to take a couple generations. That's why I'm focused on the next generation. In fact, this year I'm launching a fellowship program. It's called Resilionomics in Action Fellowship. And I'm going to have a handful of young, early to mid-career kind of professionals that are going to spend like 8 months part-time online. They have jobs learning about this. And I'm going to do this every year so I can kind of seed the next generation of, let's call it pioneers and prophets in the information and the knowledge sense, to spread this on. So, my goal is to launch this the social kind of change that hopefully a next generation will say, hey, I have the information. I'm not bidding for this, high for this property that I'm going to have to spend X dollars fixing, elevating, making stronger. I'm going to discount it. And if you see enough of that, you're going to see this differentiation that we need in property values, because now property values are blind, to resilience. And really, there should be a difference. And that difference, we're going to see it down the road.
No, for sure. Aris, I know that this is going to be a popular podcast with our audience, in part because you're really equipping them. What you're doing is equipping and empowering people to actually make better choices and to take actions. This isn't just talking about risks that are out there. You're saying, well, there are things you can do to better equip and better empower yourself. I know our listeners are going to want to look you up, you and your team at Resilience Action Fund. How can our team, or how can our listeners find you and your team online?
Yeah, the website is Building Resilient, one word, buildingresilient.com. You can also go to YouTube and find the Resilience Action Fund channel, just one continuous word. And so there's a lot of information there. And definitely, if you want to get, let's say, 20 years of resilience education in a few weeks, read both of my books, you won't regret it, because you'll be looking at the world in a different way, and you'll be making resilient, smart choices that'll save your family and your pocketbook, and hopefully, keep you out of trouble, going forward. And hopefully that'll...
And Aris, I'll repeat those titles again for our listeners. It's Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability, and then the second one is Resilionomics. And you've also done some documentaries with George Siegel, is that right? You've worked with him on some documentaries. He was a former guest on the GeoTrek podcast.
Yeah, George and I teamed up. We had done each a documentary on our own, but we teamed up on this documentary called Built to Last, Buyer Beware, that's now showing on PBS stations around the country. So I urge people to watch that. It's focused on the Gulf Coast, from, let's say Fort Myers all the way up through the Panhandle, and a little bit of Jersey in that. But the message is universal, what we need to know as consumers. So, and what the system, is, it is what it is, but we don't have to be part of it. We can be our own, we can make our own choices going forward.
I was shocked by what I learned by watching Buyer Beware, and I'm can't wait to really get in more depth in your books as well. I know our listeners are going to really enjoy that as well. You're not only educating and equipping, but you're giving them resources. They can buy these books, they can watch these documentaries, and be better equipped to protect themselves and their families moving forward. Aris, I wish we could go longer. This went so fast. So much amazing information here. As we close out this episode of the GeoTrek podcast, what is one last take-home message you'd like to share with our audience?
I know sometimes this is tough, but I like to say, look, it's your money, it's your life, it's your choice. So make the right choice. Don't wait for somebody else to make it for you.
Thank you so much, Aris. We're hoping we don't see a lot of strong hurricanes hitting the U.S. this year and internationally as well. But we know if they do and other floods and other hazards, the work that you're doing is going to help people be better prepared that live there in disaster-prone communities. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast and share your vision and passion with us.
Well, thank you, Hal, for having me, and thank you for communicating this to as much of the public as possible.
Aris, thank you so much for taking time to come on the podcast. A lot of heavy material here, but heavy in a good way. You have the expertise, you have a passion for consumer education, and you're teaching us a lot here. There are really two main take-home points I got from this episode of the GeoTrek podcast. Number one, I feel like Aris taught us that really we have a broken system that's perpetuating. And something I've learned along the way, when a broken system perpetuates or continues, usually there's a reason for it and someone's actually profiting off it. In this case, it sounds like developers, contractors are really rewarded for building poorly built buildings in risky areas. They continue to profit off this. And Aris is really ringing the alarm, ringing the bell here to really educate consumers that this is a perpetuating broken system, and the people that are hurt by this are the consumers themselves. So while it would be great to see society have some safety nets and have better building codes, better regulations, Aris has really found it a passion to educate consumers. If consumers stop buying poorly built homes, if they stop buying homes in risky areas, the developers, the contractors, they couldn't continue to sell them. So really interesting point there. The second thing I really walked away from this, I love when people have a professional passion, but they show integrity by saying they apply these principles to their own personal life. And Aris has absolutely done this. He mentioned that he lives in South Florida, a place vulnerable to flooding, a place vulnerable to hurricanes, and a place with a lot of homes high at risk. But he made the point of buying a home on relatively high ground. And he mentioned this home has thick concrete walls. This encouraged me and showed me that if you want to, you can find better built buildings in less risky areas. It's a matter of putting that at the forefront of your priority list. We hear when people buy homes, they're really looking at the price per square foot. They're looking for those amenities like a new bathroom, a new kitchen, the granite countertops. Aris is saying, really, we need to take a breath. We need to stop and think about how your home is built. Because when a hurricane hits, when a flood hits, when extreme weather hits, you want to have a better built home. I mean, what good does it do to have granite countertops and an updated kitchen if the roof is off your house, right? So I thought it was really interesting and really a testimony to his character that he's followed up in his own life to make efforts to prioritize living in a lower risk area and a better built home. And it showed me if you're looking for that, you're going to be able to find that. So again, some great take-home points there here on the GeoTrek podcast. Big thank you to our listeners for continuing to make us one of the top-rated podcasts on the topic of natural disasters. Really appreciate you continuing to follow this podcast, liking, subscribing, and following our content online. And also a huge thank you to the marketing and production team at Blue Leopard Agency for helping to produce and publicize this podcast. The team is President Senneth Baker, Senior Video Producer Jeremiah Long, and Brand Manager Ashley Bryan. I'm your podcast host, Hurricane Hal. Great to meet with Aris Papadopoulos on this episode, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast.